Workers' experience of management is not a human, but in fact is an algorithmic system. Right now, the onus is on squeezing labour power for all of its worth.
You're listening to the Futures Podcast, live from the Festival of Innovation at the University of Warwick, where the work is done to imagine new tomorrows. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that will dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this session. Technology is transforming the modern workplace in unexpected ways, with algorithms increasingly shaping decision-making. But with the promise of increased efficiency comes unexpected impacts on the workers' autonomy and agency. Exploring the consequences of these new tools and their role in reshaping employer-employee relationships is researcher Craig Gent. Craig, welcome to the Futures Podcast.
Pleasure to be here, Luke. Thank you very much for having me.
My first question has to be the core of your interest, which is algorithms, and the way in which algorithms are reshaping the workplace. So how has this new tech fundamentally transformed the way we do labour?
So in my work, I particularly look at algorithmic management, and these are technologies that often via sensing or scanning or tracking monitor workers as they're working, but also direct workers as they're working. And the combination of the two can have effects beyond the actual work process and organization itself, such as the allocation of labor and shifts.
Well, you have this term, cyber boss, to describe the new environment of work that we're in. What do you mean by cyber boss?
Cyber boss is the title of my book on this subject. And really what I'm describing in it is a situation where workers' experience of management, their first experience of management as they're working, is not a human, but in fact is an algorithmic system. And in actual fact, in many cases, the algorithmic system takes on its own kind of authority that we might have traditionally ascribed to human managers within the workplace.
Could you give me an example, perhaps, of where a place of work has been transformed by new cyber boss-style processes?
So my work has particularly looked at the logistics sector so far. To take one example of a workplace, it's a sort of a back-end fulfillment center for a major supermarket. The workers there turn up to work. They sign out a scan gun. It's attributed to ascribe to them. Then the scan gun will dictate where they have to go within the warehouse, how to move within the workplace, what to scan, what to pack, where to go and when. But it's also tracking them in real time. So it's tracking their activity. So every time they scan, it's tracking their productivity. It's also tracking their downtime. So if they take time to go to the bathroom, for example, then their overall productivity score is going to come down. They do this throughout the day without seeing or interacting with any human managers. They hang up the scan gun at the end of the day. And then the following day, they receive a text message which tells them, on the basis of their prior day's productivity, whether their shift for that day is confirmed or cancelled. Often we see these technologies being used to complement wider kind of regimes of insecure work. But it's not just in the logistics sector. When people started talking about algorithmic management, originally it was really confined to the gig economy in about 2015. Then pretty soon it moved on to wider concerns about logistics and e-commerce. But increasingly, algorithmic management technologies are being seen in all manner of work, from fast food to office jobs, and even things such as the algorithmic management of emotion, which is kind of the cutting edge.
So why do you think these tools are being so quickly deployed? Is it merely efficiency, or are there other reasons that we would want to move towards a world in where there's a cyber boss ruling over a multitude of industries?
Well, there's increasing research to suggest that in many cases, supposed productivity gains are not even that clear. And so what I would wager is really that these technologies are about trying to reduce friction among labor. Labor is fundamentally the one kind of unplannable element of any work process. And the smoother you can kind of make labor, the easier it is to manage and extract profit from your processes. Unfortunately, of course, labor is not simply a commodity. It's something possessed by people. And so there is, a human collateral to it.
So what are some of the unintended consequences, I guess, especially on the worker themselves?
Unintended, it would suggest that I could, sort of see into people's minds a little bit. So whether intended or not, some of the effects that algorithmic management has upon the workers includes things like the distortion of space and time. So much in a similar way to how gambling machines sort of engineer a state of flow to keep the gambler gambling. In some warehouses, countdown timers that give, for example, 12 seconds to pick and pack a good are used in order to keep workers kind of in a state of perpetual motion, which sort of distorts their sort of whole sense of time and space, particularly if they're in a warehouse where they have to move around in ways that are optimized so that workers never coincide with one another, so that they don't, create blockages within the passageways of the, pick towers and things like that in logistics hubs. But this also means that workers are not able to get to know each other, able to be social with each other. And I would say it also undermines the conditions for any kind of collective organization.
Well, are there possible forms of resistance? Are there ways in which people can rise up against cyberboss?
That's a real... There's a sort of burning question that's in contention right now, and I think people are trying to work out the ways that looks in the future. There have been various attempts to introduce questions of algorithmic technology into the trade union movement, for example, but it's not familiar territory for trade unions, and so it's kind of been a bit of a faltering start in that sense. Likewise, there have been legislative attempts to grapple with some of these technologies, but because of the ways that the technologies works in this kind of, they're very black box, they rely on performance relations rather than sort of, traditional representations of all the data that they accrue, which is just too massive for any one person to comprehend. It sort of flies in the face of the way that legislation within committees, for example, is traditionally formulated. And among the workers that I spoke to in my research, many of them, frankly, are engaged in kind of small-scale subversive actions that we historically might attribute more to colonized people than participants in the labor movement, which I think is kind of interesting and speaks to some of the problems that are being faced. Because the workers I spoke to, I think one of the most surprising aspects of my research has been that their concerns are not really to do with precariousness, which can be fixed through contracts. It's not really necessarily to do with pay, which can also be fixed, but actually it's to do with dignity. And that puts us into kind of different territory where we have to think a bit more fundamentally about what we're doing here.
Do you have any examples of what you just mentioned there, these small-scale subversions?
Well, for example, some workers will secure for themselves a sort of special supervisory code or codes that will be used by sort of IT technicians to take them out of productivity systems so that they can take unsanctioned breaks. Unsanctioned breaks from this kind of continuous productivity calculation is one of the most common ones, not least, both because the work itself is often tiring in the example of logistics, but also because being kept to clock so long kind of distorts people's sense of time and makes them want to take a breather. But there's also some, other sort of examples. I mean, usually sort of skiving, snooping, and subverting, would be the sort of main ones. One workplace I went into was a supermarket where a worker was able to amuse himself with product substitutions when picking people's online grocery orders.
What was he doing specifically there?
Well, he'd worked out that the one, in his words, the sort of one degree of autonomy that he had in his work was when choosing order substitutions. So, we've all had the experience of ordering groceries online and your item has not been on stock, so it's been replaced with something else that hopefully is kind of similar to what you wanted. And he also realized that in addition to being able to choose the good that would be would be the substitute, that this would also have a knock-on effect for all of the orders that day that would come after him, because what he was actually doing is updating the stock inventory itself. And so then the system believed that that product wasn't in stock and would suggest the other substitution on the basis of his choice. What he was doing was deciding that anytime someone ordered a DVD, he would substitute it for Star Wars Rogue One, because in his words, it's a sick film and everyone should see it. And it had a sort of degree of plausible deniability because it's a family film, it's an action film, it's a Disney film. Now, of course, this is churlish and, it causes some degree of reputational damage, but it was also a way of rule finding for him, so finding out what the edges of the rules are within the algorithmic system and sort of testing the boundaries of surveillance within the workplace, because these instances never came up for him. They never came up in any disciplinary. No manager ever found out. He had left the job by the time that I spoke to him. And in his words, it was about his dignity. He said, I'm being paid very poorly. I work in conditions that are frankly miserable, and I want to make my wages go as far as possible.
You mentioned briefly how the tools that are being used to track workers are producing data. So do you think the cyber boss perhaps is a precursor to cyber worker? Is this data being collected on how people do their work, so eventually they may be replaced, I guess, by machines?
Yeah, we have evidence of this happening, particularly within Amazon, for example, which is able to kind of use particularly sort of data through worn devices, devices that can sense motion, in order to optimize robots for picking tasks, for example. As I understand it, there are still some fundamental limitations to do with the size of the goods and picking up paper clips and all of these sorts of things. But yes, certainly this kind of data is not simply being used for productivity purposes, but is also increasingly tracking workers' motions and movements through the workplace.
So in that case, how can we responsibly deploy new technologies in a workplace environment?
I think the question of responsible AI deployment and creation within the workplace environment has to recognize that the workplace is effectively a fundamentally political environment already. You've got various stakeholders. It's not simply about the people who run the workplace and want to make money out of it, but it's also a question of labor. So I think that labor should be introduced, represented, I should say, in more aspects of both the generation and the deployment and the kind of continued operation of these technologies.
Well, do you think the onus is on the worker, or do you think the onus is on the manager to be able to increase efficiency but do it ethically?
Well, I think there's an onus in various directions for different reasons. I would, of course, encourage any worker to not just join a trade union, for example, but to actively participate in those structures to make sure that whatever mechanisms of representation they have, that they're actually putting the question of technology onto the agenda, because that's been a problem historically. But I think there's a huge onus, ought to be a huge onus on managers to consider the human cost that these technologies are having on workers, because, as I say, there's increasing research being done in the Nordics, for example, that questions whether these technologies are really as productivity enhancing as we might on the face of it assume, especially once we take into account employee burnout and turnover, the health and safety issues that can arise from not having human managers present within the work process.
So in that case, what sort of responsible innovations might you want to see that are going to transform our workplace, perhaps through a different trajectory other than cyber boss?
Well, look, I would love for us to be able to use computers to reduce work and all share in the benefit.
That was supposed to be the promise.
All work less overall. Unfortunately, I think the way that these technologies are being deployed, and in some cases the ways they're being created, is precisely to avoid sharing the benefits of the workplace and the benefits of production. So I think there's maybe a fundamental sort of rethinking that needs to be done there. I would like to believe that there's a version of this technology where we can use it so that everyone can benefit. But right now, the onus is on squeezing labor power for all of its worth. And fundamentally, that does become, at a certain point, injurious to human interests.
Yeah, it's about how we do this ethically, how we take these next steps, I guess. Well, I hope that Craig has inspired our audience to either skive, scoot, or subvert for the rest of the festival. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us for the Futures Podcast live from the Festival of Innovation at the University of Warwick. If you like what you've heard, you can find out more by visiting futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking Craig Gent.
Thank you.